Hello, magical experimenters. Taylor Ellwood here, doing my nightly or my weekly live stream video. I apologize for being a bit late. Normally it's at 6:30, but I just had a couple things come up and kind of had to take care of those things first. But here I am, better late than never. And tonight we're going to be talking about writing and the magic of writing. I'm actually working on my next nonfiction book. Well, one of my next nonfiction books. I actually have one that's been wrapped up and is going to be coming out soon, hopefully later this month. But which is going to be about how to troubleshoot your magic. But the book I'm currently writing, well, one of them, is The Magic of Writing, and it's all about how to integrate magic into your writing or use writing as a magical tool. And I have been a writer since, well, basically since I was a kid. I mean, I was writing bad poetry as a kid, as a preteen, and then as an early teen, and then I started writing some prose in my late teens and early 20s, and continued to write poetry, better poetry, I might add, over time. And then I got into writing nonfiction, and uh, and then after that, I started writing. I started writing nonfiction and publishing it, and then of late I've returned to writing fiction as well, and I'm publishing that now too. Uh, and throughout all of that, I have integrated magic into my writing practice in a number of different ways, and I think it's probably one of the most potent tools of magic that we have access to. And I would say really that if you think about it, writing has been used pretty much from the very beginning as a magical practice. I mean, if you go far enough back to like the ancient cuneiforms and the pictographs in Egypt, but really any culture where some type of writing evolved, you see that writing is used as a form of magical practice because people will, people back, in ancient times would write down their curses and their blessings and their spells, and the act of writing it was in and of itself a form of magical work. Now, whether they thought that way about it or not, I don't know. But I would assume that by the choice to actually take and write something down, that they were trying to immortalize it or make it into something permanent, and so it became in and of itself a magical talisman. And then you look at like the deities in regards to writing, or the spirits, like for example, Hermes, and Thoth, or Thoth, depending on how you pronounce that. And if I got it wrong, my apologies. But I mean, there were these basically these deities who were who basically worked with writing. And so I mean, you have that aspect of it. One of the spirits I've worked with actually in regards to writing is the goetic demon Ranave, who is really gifted at words and rhetoric and speech, but also is gifted with writing and can actually help you with writing. And I've worked with him sometimes to help me in regards to my writing, and also to help me be gifted in oratory as well, um, which has been very helpful. So thank you, Ranave. And then all that aside, I mean, there's just the aspect of just working with writing itself as a form of magic. I think that the one of the first things that helped me realize that writing could be magical is when I read William S. Burroughs' works, because he ends up talking about writing as a magical act, and he would talk about the cut up technique, where he would take magazines and newspapers and other things and cut them up and then randomly insert words into his writing, or he would cut up his own writing and then randomly reassemble it. And what he found is that when he did this, the writing created slippages in time where he could basically perceive different events that were coming up and possibly even manipulate those events. I've worked with his cut up technique pretty extensively, both in regards to my own writing, but also in regards to just trying different things with the writing. And what I found is that it does actually work. The most visible form of that has been through collages, where I've taken magazines and images and randomly cut them up and reassemble them. And I found that it's been very predictive. And I've actually treated it ultimately as an enchantment. In some ways, I've learned that I've had to be very careful with my collages, because I will find that I've found in some cases that they've been a little too the things that they've ended up creating in my life, the patterns have not necessarily been as favorable as I would like, which just goes to show, like with anything, that you really do have to be careful with the wording that you put into a magical working, because the wording is how you convey meaning. So whether it's a collage, or you're coming up with a spell through, through your words, you want to be careful about the wording and how you approach these things, because if you're not careful, it can backfire on you. And I say that from my own experiences, because as I said, I've created collages where the intent was, I wanted to manifest a specific type of year, and what ultimately ended up happening was something that was anything but that. It ended up being a case like 2016 was probably a good example of that, where really what it ended up predicting was actually kind of things going not quite in the direction that I wanted them to go in my life. But that's just an example of how sometimes when we create something with our magic, we don't always realize the full effect or power of it, and we have to be careful about that. And that's one of the things that I learned was I've learned over time to be more careful. I actually took a break from creating collages for a couple years, but I'm going to start creating one in 2020. But I took a break for a couple years because I realized I needed to be more careful about what I was using those collages for, and to really examine carefully. And so I thought, I'll take a break from this for a while and really consider it carefully. I actually come up with my own, sometimes I come up with my own chants and spells, and so I will use writing for that purpose. And that's kind of what my poetry has evolved into. It's become chants, and again, I find that that's really important, because you really have to think about each word you choose. I have a chant that a couple chants that I've added on to the sphere of artworking that R.J. Stewart originally came up with. I've added a few things to it or modified it, and those chants are basically the way that I connect with past, present, and future. And also really with the stellar cosmos and the underworld, and then the overall picture of the four elements and those other things. It's basically creating a 6 points, and then creating the seventh point, the overall sphere. And so I've come up with these three different chants that I use, and I've really had to think about the wording very carefully. And I've worked with the actual spirits in this case for those chants. I was working with Savuvial and Xandalophon and Metatron to come up with the chants, and working very carefully with them to come up with the right wording that would encapsulate and embody what was being done with the stellar cosmos, the underworld, as well as just the overall tying together of everything to create the sphere of art. And then beyond all of that, that isn't enough right there, Taylor. I've also used writing in my personal journal, like writing my personal journals, to discover and work through specific internal patterns, because I find that writing creates that objective reality, if you will. Once you've written something, you've manifested something, you've taken it from potential into reality. Sometimes writing is merely one step in the process of manifesting something. I've used writing as a form of magic to sometimes create a path of least resistance toward achieving a desired result. But the wonderful thing about writing is that it helps you see different patterns of behavior. You have an objective record, and so you can start to look at things critically and take them apart, and then reshape them accordingly, with your writing or without. But I've used that pretty significantly in my approach to writing magic, to find those patterns and take them apart and then reassemble them. Something else that's really fascinating me with writing and magic is actually the design of writing. I actually do the layout for my books myself. And so, when you're doing book layout, you're trying to think of the aesthetics of how the book is going to look. Good book layout is going to be something that's going to make it easier for people to read and experience the world that you're creating. It's going to be something that's going to make the writing more enjoyable. Bad writing layout can make the reading horrible. I actually read a book recently. I loved it. A very funny book, but the layout on that book was horribly done, and it made the book less enjoyable because the layout itself was a distraction. And so I think about that in regards to writing in Magic, because I'm thinking about how I can use the principles of design. And I've actually used it with some of the magical workings I've developed. I've taken principles of design with like comic book panels, for example. And what I have is I have this comic book sigil method where you have like one panel and then another panel and then another panel, and you create the sigils, and then you connect them together with these lines to create a reading of the sigil, of the comic book sigil. And that reading is the activation and firing of the sigil, of the sigils, I should say, in order to, and what happens, the way the working ultimately works is that when one of the sigils is activated and turned into reality, it pulls the other ones along. And so it takes that act of reading and turns it into a reality as well. And I use the same thing actually with writing, because if you look at how writing is set up, at least like with the English language, it's left to right, but there's, you have this space in between the words. And the way that you actually are reading, you're reading in your mind, you're connecting the concepts together in order to create the experience that you're reading about. Well, if you think about it, that's a very magical act in and of itself. And so I actually take those principles of design and apply them to the magical writing that I do, and also to my writing in general. Um, if you end up reading any of my fiction ever, you'll find that I've really tried to create a very vivid world that draws people in, because the best fiction is the fiction where things come alive. And that's been my experience with fiction, and good fiction that I've enjoyed. And so it's something that I try to emulate. And part of that is again drawing on that magical aspect, to make it a reality. There's lots more I could say about magic and writing, but I'm gonna cut the video here for the moment. But leave comments below, leave questions. If you have questions about magic and writing, feel free to put those into play. And if you don't, I'm going to likely go ahead and continue this topic at least one more video next week anyway, because it's a fascinating one, and quite frankly, I'm really enjoying writing a book on the topic. It's been something I've been wanting to write for years, and I'm finally getting around to it. All right, thanks for watching, and have a great week, and see you next week.